Well, hello, Internet. Like so many other longtime Star Wars fans, I was floored, mesmerized, and delighted to see Return of the Jedi era Luke Skywalker look so amazing in the latest episode of Luke's Doomed Jedi Academy, which happened in that episode of The Mandalorian, which happened in the episode of the Book of Boba Fett, in a show that should have been called Star Wars Tales of Mandalorian and Jedi. But I digress. I would like to think that everyone just wants to see a straight up ongoing Star Wars anthology series that can hop around to cool Star Wars stuff in any era and not worry too much about season long character development, unless that happens to be, truly interesting. But, typically it's not the case. Anyone remember Justice League Unlimited? That was an amazing anthology show with little to no filler, just all inspired awesome every week. It was beautiful until it was no more. Anyway, after the final episode of Mandalorian Season 2, where we saw that digital abomination Luke Skywalker, I'm really glad they abruptly righted the ship here by literally hiring the person on the internet who came out with 100 times better of a deepfake a week after the episode aired. Can't hire him, or can't beat him, hire him. Props, Disney. So many props. Now, please go back and redo the Luke Skywalker scenes in The Mandalorian. Let's just pretend like the original didn't happen and go full throttle into George Lucas Special Edition mode. I will hold zero grudges. But it would have been way easier to get Luke Skywalker on screen for a Luke's Jedi Academy series in, say, 1985. And way more meaningful. It's been like 37 years since then, 39 since Return of the Jedi. Kind of don't care that much at this point. Not very deeply, at least. All my Star Wars feels are pretty muddled at best. I've been struggling to figure out just what in the world I expect of Star Wars at this point after the whole Skywalker saga has rigorously concluded. Just kind of open to suggestions. Any ideas? Anyone? Just more random Star Wars stuff? Okay. Anyway, what I want to talk about in this video is the emotional abuse of the teachings of the Jedi that both Ahsoka Tano and Luke Skywalker push on the Mandalorian and the child Grogu. Also in related nonsense, there's the problematic theology of the Force that doesn't seem like it can be fully fixed from a story perspective. But first, the abusive teachings of the Jedi. Traditional Jedi teachings from the prequel era echo Jesus Christ's teachings from Christianity and Buddhism's on attachment, friendship, and celibacy, not to mention the black and white, rigid moralizing. In one sense, Luke Skywalker is just peddling more Yoda stuff. At one level, this is just nostalgia, where the character Luke happens to be in his spiritual development. But at another level, this is exactly the kind of abusive nonsense that pushed his father, Anakin Skywalker, over the edge into the throes of the dark side of the Force. Are humans really supposed to be devoid of human attachments? The science of psychology would seem to strongly indicate that humans are at their best peak emotional performance as stable, sentient life forms in the midst of family, friends, romantic pair bonding, and like-valued tribal communities. Jedi teachings are straightforward abusive psychology for most people. Period. I get the sense that the storytellers are trying to pass this off as just another flavor of philosophy. The Mandalorians have their creed of loyalty and solidarity, and the Jedi have theirs too of, no attachments. And as long as someone is making a choice, it's all okay, but is it? Does little Grogu need to be forced to choose between armor and a sword? They do know that knights tend to have both armor and swords, right? And that it is perfectly normal and healthy to have friends who stop by and check up on you once in a while, and that this isn't typically considered a weakness. I'm assuming we're talking about the mental health of what we might consider typical sentient social species in the Star Wars universe. Why would you even bother forcing this kind of choice? Why would it even be an issue? Maybe Grogu could bring it up or say, I would prefer something so stringent on, his own terms, but to force the choice on him lopsides things pretty hard. Sometimes you might have to chop your arm off if you're pinned under a rock for a long time and there's just no other way to survive. But that doesn't mean we start a religion where we make everyone decide between chopping their arms off at the door, right? This is clearly well into the ballpark of psychological abuse, and mere choice isn't going to save the day. Ahsoka Tano, of all people, should have been acutely aware of what precipitated the downfall of her master, Anakin Skywalker. And yet, there she is, right along with Anakin's son, pushing the same nonsense detachment tropes that drove Anakin off the deep end to becoming Darth Vader, and entailing the extermination of all of her Jedi friends. Anakin was born a slave against his will and chose to be a Jedi, living a life of complete detachment to the rest of humanity. A slave of the Force, if you will. So his choices were between extreme slavery and extreme slavery. Not, hey, do you just want to be a normal human child, have friends, family, hobbies, etc., and a generally wholesome life? That wasn't in the cards, was it? And as someone pointed out to me on the internet, attachment is exactly what Luke used to bring his father back to the good side of the Force. At which point Luke switches modes back to Jedi cruise control, apparently, and doesn't think too hard about things until after he's a failed self-exiled Jedi in Episode 8, The Last Jedi. Who taught you to run from all your problems, Luke? Oh, literally all of your Jedi role models. Thanks, Obi-Wan and Yoda. But that's the typical aversion behavior for extremist mindsets, isn't it? You're suckered into the mental laziness of black and white thinking, and consequently, it's so often easier to avoid the intense issues. Couldn't Yoda and Obi-Wan have started amassing a grassroots rebellion of their own long before the rebellion we know? Or maybe they could just go and hide. So, the bipolar Force problem is the other thing I want to talk about. The whole narrative arc of the Force through the 3 Skywalker trilogies has us believe that the Jedi of the Old Republic were too arrogant and too blind to the work of the dark side, who let themselves be pulled into military conflict rather than remain peacekeepers. In Episode 8, Luke Skywalker makes his argument explicitly as what apparently is common knowledge, or at least what he sought out and discovered. He says, the Jedi at the height of their powers allowed Darth Sidious to rise, create the Empire, and wipe them out. It was a Jedi Master who was responsible for the training and creation of Darth Vader. And for these failures, we are to believe the Force rightly judged the Jedi, and that the massacre of the vast majority of the active members was morally justified. One Jedi goes off the deep end? Does that really indict the Jedi in general? Do you really think Anakin was Obi-Wan Kenobi's fault? Seriously? Let's have a public execution of Obi-Wan then. Maybe that's how the upcoming Disney Plus Obi-Wan series should end. They should reframe his sacrifice on the Death Star where he allows Darth Vader to kill him so that Luke, Han, and Leia, Chewbacca, and the droids can escape as just what he deserves for being such a negligent Jedi teacher. Seems pretty extreme, doesn't it? The storytelling problem is that Jedi are clearly portrayed as just struggling heroes who aren't omniscient or omnipotent, who aren't interested in war, and who would gladly end it if they knew who the Dark Lord of the Sith was, who was manipulating the galaxy. They're obviously relatable do-gooders. They are not evil or even particularly corrupt. They're mostly just in over their heads, and whatever punishment they deserve for their relative failures probably shouldn't have been along the lines of mass murder and handing the galaxy over to galactic Nazis for a spell. Granted, this all involves a galaxy-wide war where surely billions of sentient life forms are suffering and dying, but that is mostly the fault of the Dark Lord of the Sith. The Jedi did not cause the conflict, and the instant they were made aware of who Palpatine really was the instant they tried to end things. They were not at all warmongers. They could not have snapped their fingers and ended the Clone Wars. Not using the clone armies nefariously provided to them by the Dark Lord of the Sith would not have stopped the separatist droid armies from oppressing the galaxy, where they're just supposed to stand around and go, yeah, droids are everywhere making things horrible, but we wouldn't want to get sucked into war. Should they have just been somewhat more zealous light side Jedi who could more easily have seen through the veil of darkness to the truth before too much atrocity happened? I guess. Might not the Force have just sent a fucking memo anyway? Hey, that dude Palpatine is the Dark Lord. Everybody sees it. We're like, oh, well, let's not let him do all these shenanigans then. Problem solved. Communication. Probably would have solved a lot of issues. I mean, aren't these not just a few degrees of failure on the part of the Jedi? I mean, we're not talking about Jedi who are like Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, who is outwardly good with the community but is completely rotten on the inside and uses his social collateral to stir up convenient violence against benign romantic competition. That's a murderous bad guy in sheep clothing. Probably deserves to tumble to his death. But does someone like Mace Windu deserve that? I can't think of a single Jedi as portrayed in the movies or the Clone Wars series that does. I mean, even Anakin was largely a good person who just got pushed way too far beyond his ability to cope, and he was taken advantage of by multiple parties. But does a slight failure of discernment from an otherwise devoted light side force user, from all the other Jedi, do they all truly deserve such vicious censure? I don't think so. I'm sorry, the Force is playing this both ways. The light side of the Force and the dark side of the Force are not two separate gods. It's the same Force with a good side and a bad side. The Force is more akin to having a bipolar episode overreacting to what are only understandable degrees of moral and spiritual failure of the Jedi. I mean, the Jedi certainly have their issues, as I've discussed, but Palpatine has way worse issues, and the galaxy is just handed over to him as a prize for what? Being super duper more evil than the Jedi are super duper good? Is that how it works? Be good at something. Don't care what it is, just be the best, and you win. Even if it's the best at being evil. I mean, the Force is ultimately amoral. It's not your friend. It doesn't necessarily have your best interests in mind. If the Force wanted the Jedi to see through the deception of the dark side early on in the Clone Wars, it just would have. If the Force has a quite overt, admitted dark side, then has anyone considered that this is arguably mostly the Force's fault? The Force didn't have to help Palpatine with anything at all, but it did. If the same Force who's helping you do good is the same Force that is helping the bad guys do bad, whose side is the Force really on? Seems to me the Force needs to be on its meds rather than delighting in abusive extremes. It's a naturalistic fallacy to assume that since the Force appears to represent the highest natural order of right and wrong in the universe, that this necessarily means it's ultimately good somehow, especially when everyone explicitly knows that the Force underwrites the dark side of, well, itself. The truth is right there in your face, but no one bothers to point out the elephant in the room. It would be one thing if no one knew that both the light side and the dark side of the Force were ultimately two parts of the same entity, but no, it's right there in your face, just no one seems to process it. The truth is, the Force needs to be disowned as an entity worthy of personally, emotionally investing in. Perhaps Force-sensitive folk can't help but have some idea of what the Force is up to, like knowing what the weather is like when they step outside, but they don't have to agree with it or treat its inconsistent nature as divine. Even when the Force is being good, if that's really just a segue towards atrocity, then maybe it's inappropriate to be on that roller coaster at all. If a human did that to you, where they were nice to you and then later stabbed you in the back, you would likely distance yourself from that obvious toxicity. Same with the Force. The Force is either an unstable bipolar god who has no interest in being on divine medication for the sake of the general well-being of life in the galaxy, or is more akin to a lobotomized god's amoral unconscious that merely waxes and wanes in relatively arbitrary moral dispositions, much like the meandering and ultimately meaningless plots of good and bad dreams. It's all sentient, compatible fodder like in a dream, but there's no coherent personal will behind it. Either way, the Force is not your friend. If you think you have a coherent and good relationship with it as a Jedi, you're delusional. Conclusion: Star Wars tries to have it both ways. The Jedi have to be heroes, and they have to deserve massacre. And those two things just don't go morally together. I doubt there is any way to truly resolve that tension in the story without entirely morally delegitimizing the Force, as I've described. The Last Jedi made a big deal about the weapons manufacturers selling weapons and ships to both the New Republic and the First Order. Well, guess what? The Force itself is doing the same thing, but way worse. Older Luke Skywalker cut himself off from the Force, which honestly makes perfect sense, but he still wants to maintain reverence for it, and that part really doesn't. I mean, I respect the power of gravity, as falling can hurt you or kill you, but I do not revere gravity or any natural amoral force. Younger Luke's budding Jedi Academy is still preaching inhumane and unnecessary doctrine that is most often going to lead most social species to emotional ruin of one sort or another. That is, unless having a high midi-chlorian count also makes you a prime candidate for being an asocial, emotionally detached celibate monk. How often do you suppose those planets naturally align? Not too often with social, sexually reproducing sentient species, I would think. About as often as being Catholic and having leadership qualities aligns with a necessarily celibate priesthood. That always goes well. Such pointless stringency is demonstrated as such in a world of plenty of other sects and religions who have leaders who can marry and are just as good at their jobs. I'm not really sure the failure of Luke's Jedi school, as embodied in Ben Solo, who turns into Kylo Ren, really reprimands the core inhumane problems with the Jedi teachings as much as I would prefer. Luke is just frightened of Ben's power and overreacts, alienating the young Jedi to the dark side. Perhaps Luke would have better dealt with the nuance of Ben Solo's struggle had Luke not been stuck in the black and white thinking patterns of the Jedi. But, honestly, anyone might have been that threatened. Life sometimes brings us to extremes, but that doesn't mean we have to invite them. So if none of these issues are really addressed, I'm sorry, the Jedi teachings and the will of the Force are basically emotionally and morally abusive garbage that only find traction because of the entertainment precedents of Star Wars, and that real-world religions keep that kind of black and white thinking mumbo-jumbo nonsense readily in stock. Nostalgia teaming up with faith is storytelling running on fumes, I think. I mean, where is this really going to go? I mean, how are you going to avoid it forever? Disney wants to milk the Star Wars cash cow for a really long time, right? Maybe this stuff needs to be figured out. I don't envy anyone who has to make sense of that to viewers who might be expecting some meaningful depth on occasion amidst the fantasy adventure. The Last Jedi tried to go there to an extent, but got a huge backlash for it. People are always going to want there to be some wholesome relationship to the Force with heroic Jedi in the mix, and I don't think that's really possible in any meaningful way. The original Star Wars got away with this kind of stuff because it was revealing a mystery. We didn't necessarily know enough of the picture to judge the picture, but the Boba Fett is kind of out of the Sarlacc on this one. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Please tell me what you think in the comments, and may the Force be blessedly indifferent to your flourishing.